Maya is the name of a group of Indian tribes in southern Mexico and northern Central America and the name of an old civilization in the same region. The Maya, who were one of the most famous Indian tribes, usually built their cities in the heart of the rainforest. The area of Maya life and activity included the southern border of Mexico, as well as all of Guatemala and El Salvador. The Mayan people were the creators of one of the most advanced civilizations of Central America in the pre-Columbian era, which had very impressive achievements in art, architecture, astronomy and mathematics. Even now, there are groups of Mayan tribes living in Mexico and Guatemala. The Mayans, using their past civilizations such as the Olmec, were able to establish a huge civilization in Central America between 250 and 900 AD. The history of the Maya is divided into three important periods and includes the pre-classic period or primitive life, the classic period or the golden age, and the post-classic period or the decline of this civilization. These people spoke many dialects of the Mayan language and had a kind of primitive hieroglyphic script in which they wrote works. The Mayan civilization was weakened by the neighboring tribes and eventually disappeared with the invasion of the Spanish. Before this collapse, the Mayas suddenly abandoned their civilization and huge cities and took refuge in the lap of the mountains. The reason for this event is still unknown due to the disappearance of the written works of that period and various theories. After that, the Mayan civilization was abandoned, and the authority of the mountain Maya was first lost to the Aztecs and then to the Spanish. Today's Mayan population, who are the survivors of the ancient rulers of Central America, is about 7 million people, who live mostly in southern Mexico and the mountainous regions of Guatemala and Belize. Speculation about the arrival of the Maya to Central America dates back to the 10th century BC, and the first signs of settlement and habitation of the natives have been determined in the archaeological excavations of 2600 BC in the country of Belize. The Mayan calendar refers to 3114 BC, and of course an old accepted Mayan story also describes the events of 1800 BC. In the early days of the Mayans, they first came from the northern regions of America to the south and settled in the highlands of Guatemala and created a huge civilization. The history of Maya civilization is divided into three periods: pre-classic, classic and post-classic. The pre-classic era of the Maya civilization covers from about 1000 BC to 250 AD. This period itself is divided into three stages: initial, middle and final. With the beginning of this period, which goes back to the end of the second millennium BC with the discoveries made, the tendency to urbanization and urban life emerged and villages and cities were created. The Mayan line was created and the old Mayan life in the beginning of this era, which was based on hunting and clustering, turned into an urban and agricultural life. There is little information about the early life of the Maya, but from the middle period, which corresponds to 4 centuries BC, according to archaeological discoveries, more information has been obtained, which shows the cultural fusion of the Maya with the Olmec civilization, from previous traditions. In the final stage of the era pre-classic Maya, the main urban buildings appeared. This stage lasted until 250 AD. This final stage has actually been considered the beginning of the flourishing era of Maya civilization. This phase, which is considered the golden age of the Maya, was from 250 to 900 AD, and in that Maya reached the peak of their power and brilliance. Large city-states emerged and cities like Tikal were built. At that time, it is estimated that nearly 2 million people lived in the Mayan territory, of which 100,000 people lived in Tikal. Most of the buildings built, except for houses and urban facilities such as waterways, were related to huge and luxurious religious buildings. Magnificent cities such as Copan, Chichen Itza, Tikal, Teotihuacan and Palenque emerged in the Yucatan region. In this period, it was common to use gold in religious occasions as well as for makeup and decoration. During this period, the level of life and its quality in Maya cities had reached its best state. The victories of the Mayan military in the battle with the neighboring tribes and cities outside the territory and the abundance of provisions and facilities that resulted from the planning of the ruling class of the society had created a kind of relative prosperity for the Mayan society. On the other hand, Trade between the far and near coasts and the existence of very long footpaths between the cities had provided the ground for the progress of this people in the classical period. During this period, more than 100 big and small cities emerged. Of course, sometimes building a new city was equal to the evacuation of another city, but nevertheless, the speed of urban development and their skill in designing the systems required for large cities are among the characteristics of the Maya among other tribes. It is ancient America. The best and most important identifiers of the Maya civilization during the classic period were its four principles, which were religion, art, architecture, and their society. The post-classic era of the Maya civilization covers from 900 AD to the 16th century, when the Spanish invaders arrived. In one of the most mysterious and unknown historical events, the Mayas suddenly left all their civilized and prosperous lands and took refuge in the mountains. The reason for this sudden migration is not clear. How did the magnificent and great cities of the Maya suddenly become uninhabited? Various hypotheses such as the spread of infectious diseases or attacks by primitive invaders as well as religious beliefs have been proposed, but none of them have been confirmed so far. The Mayas, who had been declining since the 9th century AD, left their cities one by one and took refuge in the corners of the forests. Although the lack of literary works and the loss of Mayan texts have made it difficult to find the cause of this phenomenon, but according to the content of the traditional and late Chilam Balam book, we can point to the fear and despair that arose in the Maya society according to a prophecy. After the sudden migration of the Maya, new tribes came and conquered the lands of the Maya. The great city of Chichen Itza fell into the hands of the Toltec people, who were semi-savage tribes living in the highlands of Mexico. Other tribes also began to conquer other Mayan lands and almost all the results of the Mayan civilization were lost. This process continued until the 13th century, and finally in the 13th century, the Maya succeeded in regaining the sovereignty of their cities. But with the difference that instead of one government, 16 small governments ruled the Maya lands at that time. The Mayan culture is relatively the previous period had become much weaker and was almost overshadowed by the Aztec civilization, and eventually the Mayan civilization was dismantled by the invading Spaniards. The conquest of Yucatan by the Spanish was more difficult than the conquest of other American civilizations and nations. And although they won within 50 years, it took them about 170 years to fully dominate these lands. The arrival of the Spanish was in 1511 and Itza was the last resistance that was crushed in 1697. During the conquest of the Mayan lands, the Spanish were faced with a people who no longer had the political independence and extraordinary military power of the past years, but they strongly resisted the European aggressors. In such a way that Hernández de Córdoba, the Spanish explorer of this land, died due to the wound he received in the battle. The Mayas continued their lives as subjects of Spain for a long time in the mountainous areas. And still many of them live in the countries of Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and El Salvador, who have preserved many traditions from their civilized ancestors in the previous 2 millennia. The number of Mayas today is about 7 million people, and a large population of them have become Spanish speakers. The Maya society was formed from interconnected tribes that had gradually gathered in the centuries before Christ, and although the culture in the villages and cities was in conflict with each other, the existence of the king-god system in this country caused the affinity of the culture, language and religion of the inhabitants. The Mayan territory had become a general cultural type in the Mayan society. In the Mayan system, social class was considered very important and everyone had to inherit their position from their ancestors. The king was placed at the head of everyone and the hierarchy was strictly observed. The Mayas lived in the cities according to the classes they had. The most important occupations in Maya society were religious and priestly occupations, army officers, scribes, archivists, construction engineers, and merchants. In addition to these jobs, the lower classes had jobs such as construction workers and industrialists whose quality of production was such that it seems that these people were trained in a specialized way. Other occupations of people in the Maya society included agriculture and service activities in the city such as cooking, cleaning, and serving, where the ratio of people was usually very effective in obtaining each of these jobs. The Mayans used to sleep babies in special cradles where the built-in boards spread the babies' heads, and they considered this beautiful and lucky. Their traditional foods, as can be understood from the writings and paintings as well as the traditions of today's Mayas, are combinations of meat, vegetables, corn, and various seasonings. During famine or war, food was supplied from warehouses, which were under the supervision of the king. Commerce was very prosperous in the cities, and it was special for the noble class that these markets were established in the main squares of different cities. The main square of the city covered an important part of the daily city activities, except for the monsoon markets that had specific and predetermined times. These activities included religious celebrations and victory banquets, parades, shows and tribal gatherings. Maya society in the pre-classic period was based on tribal life, and each tribe had a separate chief who supervised the religious, family, and commercial activities of the tribe. In the final stage of the pre-classic era, a new government system based on central government emerged in the Maya society, and that was that the Mayas came to the conclusion that in a society, the king can handle the affairs of all the people better than the chief. The king was considered to be the mediator between gods and humans. And little by little the acceptance of the royal system became widespread in the Maya society. Religious priests confirmed this point in order to gain influence, and the belief became common that disobeying the king's order would result in divine and earthly punishment. In order to establish as much order as possible in the territory under their command, the Maya kings created a class system and chose clerics and soldiers from their relatives. During this period, Maya society was divided into elite and non-elite groups. The elite society, which was the class of the rich, itself had two ranks. The first rank was related to the royal family, and the second rank was the rank of clerics, merchants, and professional warriors. The non-elite category was farmers, artisans, hunters, and artists. In the meantime, skilled artisans had a position and position superior to others. In the Maya political system, sometimes a woman reached the chancellery and took charge of all affairs, and this was when there was no man from the royal family to do this. The clothing of the classes were different, and although the women in both classes wore cotton clothes or loose skirts and shirts, they had different embroideries. The men of the lower class wore a cloth called axe, but the elite men used a cloak called padi. Slavery was prevalent in the Mayan society, and the slave trade was one of the important business matters of the Mayan society. A person in the Mayan society could be enslaved in three ways. 1. He might be the head of a poor family for a better livelihood, obtaining money to improve living conditions. 1. Sell his family members as slaves. Second, it was possible for someone to commit a crime, and in this case, it was possible to be sentenced to slavery as a fine by the judicial authorities. And thirdly, the people who were taken as prisoners of war in the battle with other ethnic groups were automatically considered slaves and were sold by warriors. Of course, if the captive was from the upper classes and a nobleman of the enemy societies, instead of being enslaved, he would be killed during a ceremony with special respect. Which, of course, was completely different from the Aztecs' method of sacrifice. Family system. In Maya society, the family was the smallest social unit, which consisted of parents, children, and slaves. Among the Maya, each family in turn was located among a larger family that built their houses around each other in a common courtyard. Marriage was based on position, and the girl's father would find a groom at a young age through brokers whose profession was to find suitable husbands and suitors for girls among different classes. Polygamy was allowed only for the elite class, and the marriage ceremony was performed more or less away from the ceremonies and the involvement of the clergy. In the traditions of the Maya, blood and race were original, and everyone found their social base according to their paternal ancestry. In the eyes of the Maya, a family was of nobility if both men and women's paternal ancestors were famous people.